Hey, we'll get started now. Good evening. My name's Mike. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I want to thank you all for coming and welcome you to tonight's event with Howard Norman. Before we get started, I want to mention just a few of the bookstore's upcoming events. Our summer event series is winding down, but we have some wonderful authors left on our schedule. Tomorrow night, Mail Malloy will read from her short story collection, Both Ways is the Only Way I Want It. The reading will be here in the store at 7. It is free. Next Monday night, Carl Hyacin will read from his new novel Star Island at the Brattle Theater. The reading will start at 6. Tickets are $5, and you can still get those up at the registers. And next Wednesday, Colson Whitehead will read from his novel Sag Harbor, and that will be in the store at 7. And it is also free, and you can find details on these and other upcoming Harvard Bookstore events in our summer events flyer, or you can always go online to harvard.com for full listings. I'd ask everybody to take a moment to turn off or silence your cell phones if you have those with you. Tonight I'm very excited to welcome Howard Norman to Harvard Bookstore to read from his new novel, What Is Left of the Daughter. Mr. Norman is the author of 5 previous novels, including The Northern Lights and The Bird Artist, both of which were nominated for the National Book Award. Mr. Norman is a 3-time winner of National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, and he was awarded the Landon Prize for Fiction. He currently teaches the MFA program at the University of Maryland. What Is Left the Daughter is written as a long letter from a father to his estranged daughter, attempting to reveal something he has kept secret for 21 years. Orphaned after his parents' suicides, Wyatt Hillier moves in with his aunt and uncle in Nova Scotia and helps with his uncle's toboggan business. Wyatt falls in love with his adopted cousin Tilda, who is involved with the German students, and Wyatt's uncle becomes increasingly obsessed with reports of German U-boats off Canada's eastern coast. As World War II progresses, the novel's characters find themselves touched by the war's violence in surprising ways. Publishers Weekly called What Is Left the Daughter a testament to Norman's mastery of the craft, and Entertainment Weekly said of the book, Norman writes with spare elegance and dry humor, and the extraordinary emotional power of the novel is earned with authentic grace. We will follow Mr. Norman's reading with a question and answer session. We'll end with a book signing here at this table. Copies of What Is Left the Daughter are available to purchase right up at the registers. We do ask that you purchase your copy before having it signed. And as always, I thank those of you who do purchase a book tonight. By doing so, you're supporting this local independent bookstore and this author series and making it possible for Harvard Bookstore to bring wonderful authors like Howard Norman to you. So join me in welcoming him to the podium.
I have to borrow a book from you. Thank you. Forgot to bring one. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I have some of my oldest, dearest friends here, so it really is really wonderful. I won't be long-winded about this. I think thank you for setting the scene. And I'm going to read a chapter from this book. It's not a long chapter, and it just needs a couple of sentences. While the sinking of a U-boat, by a U-boat of a ferry, is the journalistic basis of this book, really the few novels I've written all have one thing in common, and that's I'm interested in the most difficult possible courtships that can happen. And a friend of mine said, well, in Howard's books, 2 people finally get together after they've exhausted all negative possibilities. And I think that that's actually accurate, and this is no different at all. In 1942, there were already a lot of sinkings of ferries off the coast of Newfoundland and Halifax. The psychological tension that was built up is archived in newspapers, in radio reports, all of which are in the Halifax archive. They are harrowing to listen to, and the import of what was happening came through Halifax and into the outports along the Bay of Fundy and all through Nova Scotia. In 1942, there were 61 German students, these are facts now, German students at Dalhousie University. They were having a very rough time because of the war. Um, One of these in my book is named Hans Moring. He's a philology student, the old term philology we don't use anymore. Meets a young woman named Tilda on a bus, and they go back to Tilda's hometown of Middle Economy. Those of you that know Nova Scotia know that there's upper economy, middle economy, and lower economy. And so if you're going from east to west, life gets worse, and reverse is the other way. And middle economy is a place that I know quite well. And he takes up residence above a bakery owned by Cornelia Tell, a woman there, and starts to court Tilda. And they fall madly in love. And almost as if the war approaching and it accelerates their romance, they get married. But before that happens, the narrator, Wyatt Hillier, Tilda is his adopted cousin, has fallen in love with her and is just madly in love. So here comes this handsome German boy with this larger context of the war into this small village of which there is no secrets, and they start courting very openly and sleeping together. And Wyatt has now these volcanic emotions and jealousies. And that sets the scene for the chapter I'm going to read, which is called "The Sooner You Might Declare Yourself to Tilda." And this is the aunt. Tilda's mother is still alive. She has not yet been, I won't give away too much. But this is a story about a young man who's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we keep experiencing that, of course, in history. The whole book is an epistolary novel. It's one letter, as you said, thank you for that, from Wyatt looking back, writing to his long estranged daughter, a character who is developed in absentia. Her name is Marlis. And this is the story of what happened. This is the part of what happens when Hans first comes to dinner with this overwrought uncle in extremis about what's happening in the world. He is a maker of sleds and toboggans, and his entire shed is covered with the headlines of these sinkings. So you see what state of mind he's in. I always wondered what Hans Moring thought of there being no books in my aunt and uncle's house. He couldn't help but notice this, him being a philology student. Me, I always felt a house that contains books, not only a Bible, has a concealed spirituality. And maybe I thought that because so few people in middle economy left their books in plain sight. Reading was a private enterprise when it occurred, especially of novels. Come to think of it, Marlis, most of your mother Tilda's reading took place in the 3-bedroom middle economy library, the only stone building in the village, located a short walk from the bakery. I recall Tilda shaking off the winter cold by the wood stove at home and saying, "This afternoon I've read straight through a collection by Catherine Mansfield. It's called In a German Pension." Catherine Mansfield is from New Zealand. Her stories are too excellent to summarize. I shouldn't say no books were in the house, because your mother, Tilda, signed out the Highland Book of Platitudes. Now, the Highland Book of Platitudes is an actual book, self-published in Scotland, and it contains a whole bunch of completely useless platitudes about life, but some of them are really compelling, and Tilda is quite addicted to this book. Tilda signed out the Highland Book of Platitudes on her 18th birthday. How do I know that she never returned it? Because I'm looking at it right now. It's on my kitchen table. It's possible she considered the Highland Book of Platitudes, despite all propriety, as a kind of birthday gift to herself. As far as I know, the librarian at the time, Mrs. Bethany Oleander, born and raised in Newport Station, didn't get after her about it. Then again, I doubt that the Highland Book of Platitudes was in great demand. The book has a frayed red leather-bound cover. Yet, the book was in demand nightly by Tilda. She kept it by her bedside. Late some nights, I'd hear her read from it aloud, never bothering to whisper. I'm jumping ahead a little here, but I remember the first time Hans Moring came to dinner at our house. She boldly said, "Come see my library, Hans," and took him by the hand and led him into her bedroom. Door kept open, naturally. I chaperoned from the hallway. She said, "Take a look at this book, Hans. It's called The Highland Book of Platitudes. It's inspirational." My aunt served tea in the parlor. We were all there, my uncle, aunt, Tilda, Hans, and me. Hans took apart and put back together the word platitude, as the rest of us listened. "It's not that platitudes can't say important things," Hans said, "but in the dictionary meaning, I won't be exact here, platitude is a statement that's basically dull or trite, but spoken as though it's brand new, the way many politicians present their ideas, for instance, you understand." "Well, I don't find the platitudes in my book in the least dull," Tilda said, "not a single one." And with that moment, I was immediately alerted to two things. First, the fact that Tilda was not pleased. Second, maybe Hans had fallen just a little from grace, and that was my hope. "Well, thank you, Hans. I've learned a lot," my aunt said. "We're in for supper now." A week later, Tilda announced, "I've invited Hans Moring to supper." "What's the hurry?" my aunt said. "The invitation's made," Tilda said. "Which evening?" "Tomorrow evening. I'll get out my recipes." "It'll be nice for Hans," Tilda said. "He's only been eating Cornelia's sandwiches." "I hope he's shared them with you," my aunt said. "Is that your way of saying you haven't seen me for supper lately?" The next evening at about 6:30, Aunt Constance had the table set with her best china and Christmas cloth napkins. No tablecloth, but she had polished the wood. Hans was seated next to Tilda. I occupied the one chair opposite them, my place setting noticeably centered alone at that side of the table. Of course, my aunt and uncle sat at either end. My aunt served baked salmon, boiled potatoes, bread, and rare at our table, white wine, and there was a pitcher of water, too. She said a prayer. Hans dug right in, wielding his fork in that different fashion. Well, at this point in Nova Scotia, no one had ever really seen people that ate in the European style, where you cut and then eat it with your left hand and hold the fork prongs downward. This was a new thing then. Wielding his fork in a different fashion. "Well, won't you look at that?" my aunt said, and we all turned to the dining room table. Half a dozen children had their faces pressed to the glass. "The baker, Cornelia Tell, must have said something to somebody," Tilda said. "Yes," my uncle said, "you're giving those kids quite the lesson in German etiquette." He moved his own fork from his right hand to his left hand, spearing a piece of salmon and eating it. Hans caught on directly. "After dinner, perhaps, I'll sit on the porch and tell them a Grimm's tale," Hans said. "How grim?" my aunt asked. "They're our neighbor's children, after all." No. No, Hans said. "The brothers Grimm. They are famous German storytellers. Long dead now, very important. You know Hansel and Gretel?" "I read it to Tilda when she was a little girl," my aunt said. "Originally, that's a story told by the brothers Grimms," Hans said. "Those Grimm brothers," my uncle said, "did they tell any truly heart-stopping tales? If you know one of those, Hans, go right ahead and scare the hell out of those little rabble-rousers out there. Maybe toss in a few German words to boot." "You don't mean to tell me Hansel and Gretel were German children," my aunt said. "Also," Hans said, "Rapunzel and Rumpelstiltskin, both of them." "Not Rumpelstiltskin," my aunt said. "I'm afraid so," Hans said. "Well, live and learn." Hey, Allegra. Tilda wore a dress of her own design and her own making. It was ankle length, made of cotton material so dark a blue it was almost black. I'd seen her sewing it, but I'd never seen her wearing it. Hans Moring coming to dinner apparently was the occasion she was waiting for. The dress had a high collar, and Tilda had pinned an ivory cameo to it. So what with Hans wearing the same white shirt buttoned to the neck, they reminded me of a portrait of a stuffy Victorian British couple that used to hang above the card catalog in Mrs. Oleander's library. But I now realized that my making that connection of Hans and Tilda with the portrait meant I had a sudden concern about them becoming an old married couple. Who knows, maybe they'd become well-to-do and maybe they'd end up living in England. I didn't like the thought, but you can't help where your mind goes, can you? Supper was pleasant enough, all pleased past the bread, and what is life like at university, Hans? But I could see that Hans thought Tilda was the cat's pajamas. Also, they'd been seen together in public at Cornelia's Bakery, the Parsboro Wharf, walking hand in hand along the horseshoe-shaped beach. Apparently, Cornelia had even called them lovebirds. And when Reverend Witt suggested Tilda bring Hans as a guest to church, according to Witt, Tilda had said, "I have a different rendezvous in mind this Sunday." I knew they spent hours on end in the library, actually more hours than were officially posted as open, because Mrs. Oleander had given Tilda a key. Separate arrangements, just so Tilda and Hans could discuss God knows which words, plus have privileged access to the big Webster's Dictionary. At supper, no subject caused a dust-up, but then again, my uncle had not yet referred to U-boats or the war in general, and Hans didn't lecture us much on philology. He took seconds on potatoes, and so did I, and so did my uncle. There were 2 or 3 awkward silences. However, none felt like an outside presence had hushed all human voices, because had such a silence occurred, my aunt predictably would have said, "An angel is passing." All well and good, yet when Tilda stole in plain sight a spoonful of Hans's dessert of vanilla ice cream, the playfulness of it made me blurt out, "Hans, why would a person in their right mind get hypnotized 9 times anyway?" He had been hypnotized as a young man. You'll hear why. "Hans, my family," Tilda said, including Wyatt here, doesn't have much experience with hypnotism. Wyatt didn't mean anything by it. "Yes, but for the sake of argument," Hans said, "let us say that Wyatt honestly did mean something. I can educate him." "You know, Hans, I fell short of graduating high school only by a year." "Educate," Hans said, in the sense of why I needed hypnotism so many times. "Why not educate at all, then?" my uncle said. My aunt carried a tray and distributed tea and cookies all around in the parlor, and then sat next to me. Hans took a bite of cookie, leaned forward, and said, "You see, I walked in my sleep. I was most prolific at this, you might say. It started at age 10. We lived in a small village, larger than yours, yes, but not large by standards of German farm villages. We had a small house. My parents are good people, you see, and they had with me, I think you say, a handful. They had a handful. At night, I was walking long distances in my sleep. Usually I was found out on the road. Once, I was about to swim in a pond. A number of times I was found in a neighbor's garden." "Ever ride your bicycle asleep?" my uncle asked. I always wondered, could a person do that? No, Mr. Hillier, I never rode a bicycle. At least nobody reported that I had. Most often my mother or father would discover me simply sitting at our kitchen table, sometimes eating food I'd taken from the icebox while asleep. Eventually my father had to purchase inside locks, and he locked the doors and windows. Still, I walked all over the house. I might visit every room. By morning I'd be exhausted. I could hardly stay awake in school. A hypnotist in Munich was recommended. I went to him 9 times, as I mentioned to Tilda, yet hypnotism didn't work. I walked in my sleep for several years. In Denmark it stopped. I never walked in my sleep in Denmark. Denmark, my uncle said. Well, we had to leave Germany. My uncle, my mother's brother, previously was living there. He has funds. In fact, he's sponsoring me at university. Germany to Denmark to Canada, my aunt said. My goodness, I've never been further than Newfoundland. We escaped to Denmark, Hans said, in 1935. Adolf Hitler is not the travel agent you'd wish on your worst enemy. This was my father's joke, Hans said. My father always tries to bring a little light to the darkness. My mother is quite different. She always thinks the darkness is about to get even darker. That is their different natures. Well, it goes on like this, and then the tension builds up so much that the aunt suggests a game of crisscross, and crisscross was the prototype for Scrabble. You can still find old crisscross games up in Canada in pawn shops and stuff, but it was the prototype for it, and it was a little more complicated, actually. And they go over the rules, and the radio in the background is now starting to broadcast the news of another sinking, and so the uncle is getting more agitated. Remember, Hans, my uncle said, in crisscross you can't use German words. That's breaking the law. My uncle was pacing the room now. I hadn't seen him do that except when he heard terrible war bulletins on the radio. I see, Hans said. For example, you can't use Germaniowerft, the operation which builds a lot of U-boats, never mind my pronunciation. Donald, please, my aunt said. Or you can't use its goddamn son of a bitch shithole commander's name, Carl Thurman, who captained U-553, the one that sunk the Nicoya off the Gaspé. I understand, Hans said. Come to think of it, my uncle said, don't try to get away with Rapunzel or Rumpelstiltskin either. Tilda took the crisscross down from a shelf. My aunt washed and racked the dishes, and my uncle went outside to cool down with a cigarette. Tilda got all the wooden crisscross letters lined up neatly. You always have exactly 10 letters to work with. We played for an hour, and then we had seconds of ice cream. Tilda made coffee, which we took into the parlor. Back at the table, it was Hans's turn. He set down the word ravishing. That's a lot of points, Tilda said. Do you know this word, Wyatt? Hans said. Ravishing? Its definition is, well, basically, it's Tilda. Don't you agree? Quitting the game, I left the house and walked to the wharf, stood there hangdog only in shirt sleeves, roiled up. See, what had caught up with me, standing there in the cold fog of the wharf, was the stark belief that I was illiterate in matters of the heart. That is, I felt Tilda was ravishing, but I hadn't known to use that perfect word. I stood there for quite a while. Finally, my uncle's truck appeared, and I walked toward it. My aunt was on the passenger side. They were both dressed properly for the weather. You'll catch your death, Wyatt, my uncle said. I got in beside my aunt in the front seat, but my uncle opened his door and got out. He walked to the end of the dock and smoked a cigarette. Tilda said you might be down here, my aunt said. Where's Tilda now? I said. Well, she's not at home. I've a mind to go over to the bakery, I said. And do what? You'd get to the bakery and do what? Let's just get Uncle Donald and drive back to the house then. Donald won't smoke the whole cigarette, she said, so with what time we've got, listen. All right. First off, Wyatt, I took to heart your undignified behavior. I mean at supper, and later on when I eavesdropped on your game of crisscross, and just so you know, Donald and I are quite aware of Tilda and this German boy's fawning over each other right from the start. Make no mistake about it, Hans Moring has a genuine courtship in progress. I know that, I said. We need to keep our distance from it, Donald and I. Tilda's allowed her young woman's discoveries. On the other hand, and Lord knows I'm no great student of people, but when you and Tilda are in the same room, you should just see how you light up. And how often in a lifetime do you have to hear all's fair in love and war for it to become useful? Really, you see me as being in love with Tilda, Aunt Constance? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. How do you see yourself, Wyatt? The same way. Wyatt, here's my 2 cents worth of advice. The longer Hans Moring lives over the bakery, the sooner you might declare yourself to Tilda. Give yourself a fighting chance, young man. I said, but, and I don't quite know how to ask this, is there anything in the Bible or in Nova Scotia law that speaks to cousins? Tilda's merely called your cousin, my aunt said, but her being adopted, she's not blood relations, family tree-wise, she's not. I consulted Reverend Witt, and he said grudgingly, but still, he said, even the church recognizes this. Besides, Donald and I might as well be from Mongolia, considering how little Tilda resembles us. Hard not to notice, our features are a world apart. I see you've put a lot of thought into this. What I mean, Wyatt, is ethically, if you have feelings for Tilda, there's leeway. I hadn't felt the urgency to discuss this with you before, Wyatt. Neither had Donald out in the shed, but now there it is. Well, thanks for coming out here, Aunt Constance. Some rescue mission. She said, with Tilda, you might also try a divination. Some people believe in them. If a divination doesn't work, nothing happens. If it does work, life changes for the better. What'd be a proper divination, do you think? Well, she said, start with something simple. Name your bedposts after the one you love. Name my bedpost, Tilia Hillier? Is that what you're suggesting? I'm suggesting it can't hurt. When I looked over, I saw my uncle douse his cigarette by holding it above his head and wagging it a few times in the fog-drenched air. He tossed the butt onto the dock, not into the sea. My uncle wasn't much given to superstition, but he'd warned more than once, never sully the sea, or someday it'll come back at you hard, tenfold. Thank you. Okay. I'm sorry?
I heard that there was more linguistic diversity in the Sierra Nevada mountains than in the entire Proto-Indo-European tradition, even Tocharian. What do you say to that?
I couldn't agree more.
Do you feel that your souls are valuable enough that if I want to take all those Indian souls, like your memory screen?
Maybe we should get another question.
Yeah.
Anybody? We could just, yeah.
Where do you find your characters in your life? Where do you find the characters?
They're not in my life long enough for my taste. I mean, I like them. I think you should never write a character that you don't really want to be with for a long time. So there's a vicariousness. But I think any platitudes about writing are only applicable for that book. So I'm up in Nova Scotia a lot. And so these are all just pastiches and composites. You know, I think as a process, every writer's different. I tend to stop researching when what I find out happened starts to trespass on what I imagined happened. There's some middle ground there that you try to find, but I don't base my work, I don't try to recapitulate something that's already out there, otherwise it would be nonfiction. But this book is perhaps a touch more journalistic than other ones I've written. No, not the epistolary part, but just all the historical elements were all researched. The U-boats, the U-boat captains, that kind of thing. And so, you know, I enjoyed that for a change. It was interesting to me, but it took a lot of editing because you kind of went on and on and on. I mean, I was reading journals of U-boat sailors, you know, and stuff like that. It can be very obsessive, I think. Yeah.
At the end of the book, you have Hans on the bar wall. But Hans is on a photo with other German
Yes.
sailors.
Rigoleau's Pub.
Right.
Is anybody here from Halifax or familiar with Halifax? The old historic district, which is so small since the nitroglycerin thing, but are you from Halifax?
No.
Well, there's a pub, there used to be a lot more pubs, but before the anti-submarine, it's not netting, it's linked fencing was really put into use, U-boats could get in quite close and did. And there are a number of photographs, and again, if you go to the Halifax archive, you can find these. They're awfully haunting and interesting, where you'd see young Germans just in town. There were a number of interactions, marriages and so forth, and these were just young men. And then after that thick linked anti-submarine fencing was invented. They would float it out, and it would keep that from coming in. But there are photographs you can see, and they're all pretty much archived and marked. I looked at them a long time, and of course, visually, if you didn't know the circumstances, They looked like just any other young guy who was trying to have a nice time with people his own age. But this other thing was happening.
Well, and you mentioned a U-boat at the end too. I didn't know if you were implying that maybe Hans had something to do with it.
No,
No.
quite the opposite. He's quite an innocent.
Right.
To be just pretty simplistic about it, I think probably the cases of the North African guys and others who were brutally beat up, especially in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle after September 11th, really got to me. I mean, so the template would be, again, the wrong place at the wrong time. Just going about your business, being a person, having a quotidian life, and then history intervenes or imposes itself. And people who are normally very poised and quiet and so on and so forth have this other thing. And so there were a lot of instances of this in Canada. If you look at the history of Halifax, right after the war ended, there were phenomenal riots in Halifax. And paradoxically, an increase in anti-Semitic incidents. So talk about confusion and transference and all that kind of stuff. There were at that point 4 synagogues. Jews came through Pier 21 like they did Ellis Island here. And there were a lot of, Robin McNeil, who's now an American, but his father was an admiral, is developing a 6-part series about the Jewish history in Halifax. So it's really quite an intense history there. You can, that's what I got really interested in that. But again, I had to edit. I mean, it just started to become a polemic, something like that. Yeah. Lloyd.
At what point did you decide to make this an epistolary novel?
In Parsboro, right, the village right next to Great Village, that Lloyd knows very well because it was the childhood home of Elizabeth Bishop for a period of time. There was a bakery. It's closed about 2 years ago. And the baker there, whose name is Cornelia Tell, I just took her name. She told me that she'd been working, just in passing, she told me she'd been working on a letter to her sister who she hadn't seen. And I said, how long have you been working on it? She said about 7-8 years. But she didn't mean it ironically. She meant that she felt like that would be how long it would take to percolate, to get out of her system everything. And that combined with the fact that my own mother, she just passed away this February, always did this sort of strange thing when I was a little boy and would come home upset or angry about something. She would say, write that person a nasty letter, but don't send it. So I decided at age 58 I was going to send it. And that's what this is really about. So, an epistolary novel, I mean, it's an old tradition, I mean, as you know, and but this is just one letter, yeah.
But was that your starting point
Yeah.
for the book?
Yeah. I thought, why not do it? I mean, it doesn't matter if you come off as a literary Luddite or anything. I didn't care. I just thought, how could you have somebody work on something through insomniac nights and in a sense become a literate person in a way, to come to some knowledge of himself. And then the other part of it, of course, was, I think, quite simplistically put, as having a daughter who what do you actually want to leave your child? Our farmhouse or some photographs or something, but maybe an open attempt to describe how you tried to live your life. And I wanted it to make it, not sentimental in any way, and I hope it comes off that way. But yeah.
Is it also your opinion that Catherine Mansfield's stories are too wonderful to summarize?
I like her stories, and I like her notebooks a lot. She was quite eccentric, as you know, And yes, I like her. In a German Pencil Owner is her first book, and they're really, I think, beautifully crafted stories. I'm sure the bookstore carries her. Great writer. I mean, I like her stories a lot. I seem to be. I mean, she gets kind of eroticized in this novel. I don't know why that is, but she does. She's sort of reading her causes, as my mother would say, Congress. But yeah, I was reading her at the time. I don't know why. Yeah, it just happened. Yes. Anything else? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming out.